Typical lawyer's language. They want to propose amendments to the United States Constitution that impose fiscal restraints on the federal government. But what is the definition of restraint? How far does it go? Is it fiscal restraint they can only spend 5% of the total GDP of the country? Or 95%, they're both restraints. Limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government. Well, that's what the Constitution supposedly does now. Do they take in what manner it's going to limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government? In the sense of we're going to detract from certain interpretations that have come, usurpations that have appeared now. So you're talking about limitations again that are undefined. This why or that why. And limit the terms of office for its officials and for members of Congress. That one might have a limiting interpretation, because right now those terms are open-ended. So one will say, well, there is no limit. They can be there as long as they're alive, theoretically. And therefore, if you're going to limit the terms, you're going to detract in some way from what's already there. But on these other two, impose fiscal restraints and limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, it could be argued that something that increases the commerce power beyond what it is now would be a limitation of the jurisdiction of the federal government. Right. But not in the sense that most constitutionalists think of that.
Yeah, they've argued that we're fear-mongering. Well, actually, we're not calling it a runaway convention. JBS and Eagle Forum over the past quarter century, that was one of their arguments, was that there was a potential for this becoming a runaway convention. And we don't make that argument because our understanding of it, especially when you look at their application, there's nowhere for it to run away to. It already encompasses the entire Constitution. Would you agree with that? That's the situation, that it couldn't become a runaway because it's about as close to an open convention as you could get.
Yeah, in other words, that second phrase opens up the entire Constitution for review.
I don't see how any amendment directed to the power and jurisdiction of the federal government does not, by definition, limit that power and jurisdiction. That's why you write it out, to describe what the power is, and within the description, we have the limitation. So why an amendment could not accept the present powers that the government claims, could not expand those powers, could not change those powers, and still be called limiting the power and jurisdiction of the federal government escapes me. And I can't imagine some court coming along later on and saying, oh no, the word limit was there, and therefore it had to be less, even though the thing you put in was different. Or even though the thing you put in accepted a present interpretation of the powers along the lines of that Farris Amendment adopting the Supreme Court's compelling state interest theory under different nomenclature. I simply can't imagine a judge coming back to, well, no, the word was limit here, and therefore it had to be less than the thing that was already there. And it's just amazing. Would someone want to take that chance?
Right.
Would someone want to go through this whole process, come up with some limitation, which actually is an expansion, and then hope that down the road either the states will not adopt the amendment, make the whole thing nugatory, or some court will come in and say, well, no, because the original word was limit in the application, therefore this amendment is invalid because somehow it went beyond that, even though the states ratified it. No, this is a real problem. If the states ratify it, it's ratified, right?
Right.
I can't imagine a court going back and unzipping all of that process back to some word in the original application. Especially given if it's a court which, according to the proponents of the Constitutional Convention, is hell-bent on usurpation to begin with. The court's the problem.
The very problem that they say we need this convention for, they're going to run to those same people to save the solution.
Yeah. Kind of a circular argument. One would think that the first thing that you would do before you did anything else was get this judicial supremacy problem straightened out in some way. And I wrote a book on that called How to Dethrone the Imperial Judiciary, which goes through a whole laundry list of ways that can be dealt with. Besides amending the Constitution, that's the last thing you want to think of. And that would be the first thing to do. But of course, the problem is you'd have to go through, at the federal level, Congress, and at the state level, state legislatures. And apparently these people don't think we could get a statute of that kind passed. Or B, that they'd get a statute passed, but then the court would say it's unconstitutional, so they'd have the conflict where the Congress would then have to start impeaching these people. Right? Well, I would think that would be a much easier and more, in the long run, more beneficial fight to conduct. Because at least you have some idea how it might come out. At least you know what the parameters are, how many rounds there are, right, before the final bell. And maybe who the referee, ultimate referee would be, which would be Congress, because Congress has the power to impeach these people, end of discussion. Right? Whereas this thing is totally open-ended. You have no idea what's going to be proposed, you have no idea what procedures are going to be adopted, you have no idea what the state's going to ratify, and you have no idea what the courts are going to do with either the amendments themselves or the procedures that led up to the amendments. And they think this is a way to solve the problem in the short term? Especially given that this was all, to a very large extent, I think, started by the balanced budget problem, right? The spending is out of control, we're going to an economic collapse of some kind because it's unsustainable, therefore we need a balanced budget. And so now they're dumping that as one little piece into this hugely complex system, out of which the balanced budget amendment may not even appear, or it may appear so far down the road after all this has been litigated, going through the amendment litigation process, that the government's already gone bankrupt. And we have the economic and social crisis. And this has no effect on that whatsoever.
Right.
As I've said in a number of other places, it's like people being in the Grand Salon of the Titanic, planning the next liner, and not figuring out, well, how are we going to survive without enough lifeboats? Don't we need to do something about the people who don't have lifeboats? Just escapes.
Do you have any advice for state legislators who are being approached with this garbage?
I don't know. Advice, man. I ask the questions of these people, and I never get the answers. What about this? What about this? What about this? And it's, well, that won't happen, right? Or, you know, someone's going to decide that mañana. But what are the safeguards against this? How do you stop this? The beauty of the safeguard of the single amendment process is we have a single amendment. We know exactly what that thing is, maybe. We hope that we understand the language, doesn't have a Trojan horse language built into it. And it's got to go directly to those 3/4 of the states to be passed, and then we'll see what happens in the implementation. We really don't have any kind of procedural difficulties built into it, and all of the litigational problems that might arise out of that. So that's the real concern. Why aren't they just taking this step by step? One amendment at a time. Then we know exactly what we're dealing with. Now, I understand they're trying to do that with this convention theory that they will propose specific amendments, but I don't see how once that convention is set up, that you're going to be able to limit it in what it does. You can limit the first one, you're going to limit this one. Especially if Congress puts some kind of open-ended language in the call and says, well, we're going to include these amendments and any others that may be proposed, boom, end of discussion. And then you either take that or you don't. At that point, the states that have made the application are going to say, well, are we going to go along with this or are we going to back out of it? But can they back out of it? At that point, right?
Right.
Well, some states might back out and say, we're not going to send delegates. But enough states do send delegates to propose amendments and then those go out to the general population for ratification. It's a rat's nest.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And that tends to suggest that there's something behind this, just between the two of us, there's something behind this other than a real desire to bring this country back to constitutional government. That somebody wants to open this thing up, either because it will cause a tremendous amount of chaos because they love that anyway, or because they think they're going to be able to control it and drive it in the way. Why does Stevens come out, Justice Stevens come out the other day with his 5 words to add to the Second Amendment that would solve the gun control problem. Right? You can only have a gun when you're actually part of a military militia organization. Now, of course, he doesn't understand that everyone who's an adult from 16 to whenever is part of a militia organization as a matter of the Constitution. The poor fellow, you know,
Well, as you well know, that's one of the provisions of Tugwell's New States Constitution. You can only have a gun. The only people that can have guns are the people that the government says can have guns.
But that's the difference. I mean, even if Stevens' amendment were enacted, someone such as myself would say, well, who's in the militia? It's everyone from 16 on up. Every adult, able-bodied adult, unless you're a Quaker or something, you don't have a gun. You don't want a gun. Every able-bodied adult. And what kind of a gun would you have? Well, same kind of gun the Marines have, and the Army has, so forth. No problem. So the problem with Stevens is he doesn't know what he's talking about.
The left would like amendments they would like. We have amendments we would like. If they want to use a lefty introduced an Article 5 application in New York. It's not going anywhere even in New York, and it's not been introduced any other place. If George Soros wants to get 34 states to back a leftist agenda, let him try. It's just the same as George Soros trying to use the electoral. Are we going to give up electing good senators because George Soros is trying to elect his kind of senators? No, we're not. Are we going to give up?
No, he's got the money that pushes it.
But he's got
That'll
the.
get him in
But
Virginia.
man, listen. You got to listen. George Soros can get an Article 5 convention when he gets 34 states to pass an application that he writes. He can't come to hijack my applications. The states set the agenda. And so if George Soros has the gumption, he can't function in 34 states. He can only function in the big cities. Big cities, big money, big media go together. That gives you...
He's overthrown governments throughout the world.
Fine. I'm not afraid of George Soros. I understand fear. If you want to be afraid of George Soros, you be afraid of George Soros. I'm not afraid of George Soros. Well, okay, you be whatever you want. Let him do his own thing. If he can pull it off, great, more power to him. I think I can pull him off. I wasn't afraid of the teachers union. I'm certainly not afraid of George Soros.
Because of the way he wrote that, right? But you can imagine that people in the Soros crowd would be in this constitutional convention with their statistics on children being killed in school and all the rest of the thing, demanding something along that line, and they would have enough sense, because they would have gone out and read the stuff that I put out, so they know what this was all about.
Right.
They would have enough sense to say Army or something along that line. You have to be serving in the Army or the National Guard or whatever. So as to cut out the idea that the average person could have a gun. And then they would see, they'd be able to mollify the NRA because the NRA people are always willing to go along with the police and their army. And they have been since they were founded. That's why they were founded. These people to shoot, so when they went into the Army, they'd know which end of the gun to point at the enemy. But that's my real fear with this. On the one hand, I look at it and say, look, this is not going to be effective in those things that even I might say we ought to do because they'd be useful. In time, the balanced budget thing will not be effective in time. So why are we dealing with something else? It's a huge boondoggle and wheel spinning for lawyers, out of which probably a lot of garbage will come, which would never have a chance of being ratified. That's problem number 2. But number 3, the one that worries me, is that this thing, there's already a plan to get control of this thing, put in maybe a whole new constitution, or at least a sufficient number of amendments to do what the Tugwellites and the Sorosites want, and that they already have on the ground, the boots on the ground, and the money in the bank to propose ratification of that thing in 3/4 of the states. And they might actually have a chance to do it, especially if, while all this is percolating, you have a national economic breakdown. So people say, well, see, the present system of government has failed, and we're all eating cat food in the dark, right? The grid has failed. We've got to have something new. Oh, look at this wonderful thing that the constitutionalists put out for us.
Right. You remember what Rahm Emanuel said about never letting a crisis go to waste? And they create crises specifically tailored to steer public opinion to the solution that their experts have already crafted.
Right. I don't think they created this one. I think this has gotten out of hand. Because it's opened up all sorts of cans of worms they didn't want to open up. And exposed a lot of the banking system and financial skullduggery that they didn't want to have exposed. But they're prepared to use it.
Right.
And that's why they're setting up the whole martial law operation. They're prepared to use this to crack down. That's why they're into this, whether they set this up to begin with, but they're deeply into this. And if they have as much sense as I attribute to them, they are setting up the groundwork. If this succeeds according to their plan, push it through, and if it doesn't, defeat whatever amendments they don't like. Whatever comes out of this, they're going to use. And that's why they're putting money and effort and propaganda and so forth into it. I mean, I would never trust this unless they could resurrect Madison, Jefferson, Patriot. I'll give you a list of people I would send to this convention, and then let it be open-ended, because it would be an anti-federalist convention, if you know what I mean, all right? But we don't even know who these delegates are. Are they going to be Nancy Pelosi? Harry Reid? Cuomo, the governor of New York?
Well, like she said, yeah, we'll I guess with this Article 5 convention, we'll just have to wait to find out what's in it after it's been triggered and who's going to be in it. Like she said about the Affordable Care Act.
Well, at least we have a track record on that theory.
Away from the
Yeah,
controversy.
recent track record on that theory. But I think that's, that would be another consideration. How are you going to control the delegates? Who are these people going to be? Do you think you could find, I don't know how big the delegations would be, 4 or 5 people from each state maybe? You might have 200, 300 people, that'd probably not unwieldy, have that number of people. Do you think you could find from every state 5 real constitutionalists, in the sense of people who understand the constitutional principles, that would in fact be selected by the governments in those states? What would come out of Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, California? You run down that list.
Well, I mean, in Kansas, they're proposing that the governor, the
Speaker of the House.
Speaker of the House,
President of the
who's an
Senate.
executive officer of ALEC, and the Senate President and the executive officer of ALEC would put the delegates, and there'd be 2 more people involved. And they're not going to pick someone based on their constitutional understanding. They're being picked based upon their political loyalty.
Yeah, you're part of the machine. Democrat or Republican, it's one party, really. It's like this, we're going to Stalin ballot, just have 2 different names to it. You're part of the machine. The only way this thing would work if we couldn't resurrect the Founding Fathers would be to take names randomly out of the phone book.
I would rather.
Yeah, I would rather do that. I think you'd have a better chance if you took names randomly out of a phone book than pick those people.
Partisans, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, because they have, what is their major interest? It's maintaining the present system that they have, at least to the extent that it maintains their position, their wealth, their future, being appointed to boards of directors when they're getting big fees and all the rest of this nonsense, the revolving door system of government. Right? Or Harry Reid, land grabs for his son and Chinese, oh, come on, right? This is what they're interested in. They're never going to give you a piece of paper coming out of this convention that stops that.
Right. That's right.
I mean, you're going to draw up a bill, a RICO bill, and you're going to have Capone and Bugs Moran as the experts in drafting?
They're suggesting taking, the fox that's been watching the hen house and replacing him with a pack of coyotes.
Yeah, exactly. And putting the imprimatur of legitimacy, constitutional legitimacy, on all of this stuff that they've done in the past. That's the real fear. You should be having some national grand jury to indict all of these people for their constitutional violations. Not giving them a constitutional convention whereby they can come up with some new interpretation, new language that's going to constitutionalize what they've already done.
Legitimize their nefarious activities.
Well, I think just of this Supreme Court compelling state interest test, that's the emergency powers doctrine, really, right? It's compelling interest on emergency right there. The great example of that, the emergency powers doctrine, because of course we don't have an emergency powers doctrine in the Constitution, and the word emergency doesn't appear. What's the great example of that in the 20th century? It was the Weimar Constitution.
Yeah.
The Weimar Constitution had an explicit, Article 48, an explicit emergency powers provision that said under certain circumstances, emergency circumstances, the Reichs President, the Reichs Chancellor could take these actions which would abrogate, and then it listed the articles in the Constitution that could be abrogated. And if you look at those were very similar to our Bill of Rights. freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, private property, search and seizure, run down that list. In typically German perspicacity, they picked those out, laid them all out, and the emergency powers provision said you could abrogate these for a certain length of time and call up the military to do it. So they had a martial law provision. And when Hitler came in legitimately, because he was elected and became chancellor, that's what he used. The Weimar government had used it a number of occasions in various things. They had political rioting and so forth. But Hitler used it with the Reichstag burning, Reichstag fire, the so-called enabling act that he got after the Reichstag fire. And the Weimar Constitution was never rescinded under Hitler. He just went off on this emergency powers tack until finally Germany was overrun and then everything collapsed. Still operating under the Weimar Constitution in April of 1945, theoretically, although the Reichstag didn't meet in April.
Right. We have the statutory equivalent to that constitutional provision via the National Defense Resources Preparedness Act and directive that authorizes the president to take your property, put you in a work camp, basically commandeer every man, woman, and child and all their property in pursuit of protecting their country against a national emergency. And it's insanity. And the triggers are there for him to pull, this president or a future president. We are going down that same path.
But the only point I make there is that was a constitutional provision. They actually had it in the Constitution. And it was proven to be false even when it was spelled out precisely what could be done, how long it could be done, who was going to do it. We don't have it in our Constitution. As you point out, you've got all these statutes and executive orders based upon them, theoretically, that go beyond any of that.
So,
But this is what they want to deal with. They don't want to deal with that problem. They want to deal with this.
oh yeah.
Which, by the way, doesn't deal with it. Have you seen any proposed amendment that in essence overrides this emergency powers, or powers of necessity doctrine?
No.
That says there is no such thing cannot be done, that overrides this compelling state interest theory the Supreme Court says there is no such thing can't be done, and people will be penalized if they attempt to do it?
Okay. If anything, we've seen it expands it.
Yeah, that's what I find fascinating about it. Even the balanced budget one, where you'd say, well, we understand what that means. It's supposed to contract the amount of spending. No, it doesn't. It just dumps more into the area of borrowing. So the banks become more in control than ever.
Mhm.
It's as if this thing were written in a hall of mirrors, one of those in a fun house. Everything has a distorted view.
Yeah.
You know you're here with all the pictures. What's this house in there?
Craziness.